What was the most gut-wrenching thing your parents did to you? My parents never really wanted kids. I was an only child and pretty much an accidental pregnancy. From what relatives have told me, my childhood was initially good, but after I started growing out of the cute and adorable face, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked and had their own business that they started together. That business was their life and I always came second to it. Any other close family members lived states away and I barely knew anything about them until I was an adult. So I had no other family around. My entire childhood I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays, by the time I became a teenager, were often spent without my parents as they just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas and sometimes even back to school shopping. After I turned 10, my parents no longer wanted to buy a tree at all. I had to convince my parents to buy a fake one that I could build up and then take apart. Later every year when I turned 16, I asked my parents if I could work part-time for them at their business. They rejected me immediately and told me they didn't have any open spots. They may as well have just come right out and said they didn't want me there. After I turned 18, my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school and I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. Not long after high school ended, my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad who owns a truck. I ended up renting a cramped apartment and working retail. I had no real life experience and no time for college. After just a few months, I got fired because my manager legitimately had it out for me and wrote me up for the stupidest things. I ended up going broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment, so I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents begging for help, but they refused to take me in, not even for a little while to get back on my feet. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard during the winter. My friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was just a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to tell us at all. My guess is it was out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did. Eventually they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details, then they told me not to bother them ever again. Thankfully, I was able to call my grandparents from my father's side of the family. They were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant. After learning about my situation, my grandparents flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My parents didn't even see me off at the airport, despite being invited to. I had zero contact with them for pretty much a decade. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. I'm told my parents were not happy to hear that. However, I figured it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents, I was able to afford community college. I got an associate's degree, got a decent job, and eventually my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go, but I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 of its value and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My position at the time forced me to go away on the road periodically. As a result, I can end up away from home for weeks at a time. One day in late 2020, I came home after being away for over 2 weeks. Upon arrival, I found a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call the police when I noticed the van had the logo for my parents' business on the side of it. All I felt was dread. My parents had broken in somehow and were living out of my home. On top of that, they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddy-buddy. The moment I walked in I told them to get the hell out, but they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore since they'd sold it to me when they retired. I told them they'd have known that if they were in any way involved in my life, but they threw me to the wolves 10 years prior with no life experience. We argued and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door and called the police. When the cops showed up, they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie. Unfortunately, I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors had no cameras either. As a result, it was my word against my parents over how long they'd really been there and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told the police they had a verbal rental agreement with me and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that the police told me it was a family dispute and a file eviction with the courts to get them out. Since this was in 2020, getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, my parents were squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face from the information I got out of them. Their business went bankrupt, and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings. So they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father is a delivery driver, my mother is a sales associate. They were making money and the only things they contributed to were electricity and water utilities. They basically just handed me a $100 bill every month and said I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live and free because I took 18 years of their lives. They then told me to be thankful that they weren't demanding the money back for that time. When I argued back, they threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I was so at my wit's end that I ended up calling my grandparents to explain the situation to them. They were very unhappy and spoke with my parents, but they still said they had the right to stay in my home. They refused to budget. My grandpa told me he was sorry it had come to this and that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have made it. I told him not to worry, I'd have already filed for a legal eviction and would get it soon enough. I told him my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of them too. They responded with a silent treatment. My father was away most of the time, driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking. My mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room. At one point she even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom. She argued that they were my parents and they deserved better. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. I didn't ask to be born and it's a normal obligation for parents to raise their own children. I told her I knew they were trying to assert dominance, to try and keep me from kicking them out. I let her know her time was coming soon enough. Finally, after 4 months and now into early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only needed to go to court because they fought the eviction and tried to gaslight me into rescinding it. They tried to use the fact that it was formerly my grandparents' house and attempted to use the $100 monthly payments as some sort of leverage. However, there was no real rental agreement and they were smart enough not to forge one as that would have been fraud. In the end, the judge ordered that they needed to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they have zero claim on my house. After court they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh. I called them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owe them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine was theirs. But they had no right to call themselves my parents because they'd never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby, lying and now broke narcissists to their faces, then told them to get their affairs in order. They knew I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they didn't leave my house. When the 30 days were over, my father looked enraged, but my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He sneered at me and walked away. I just laughed in his face. They eventually left, but not without a lot of difficulty. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker. The exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left. What's even funnier is that they've been so convinced they could make me let them stay that they didn't bother to look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through. My mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and cramped studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. It was a lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once and the apartment was terrible. The walls were baby barf green and the carpet looked like it was 20 years old. The only window just had a view of a brick wall outside and there was no dishwasher. The stove was the smallest one I've ever seen. The toilet looked like it needed to be replaced, and the walls also did little to stop noise from neighbors. There were already 2 people loudly fighting in the adjacent apartment while we were there. My mother went out of her way to give me sad eyes the whole time. She tried dropping hints that I should be feeling guilty for reducing them to live in such a place. I just acted oblivious to it all until she finally stopped. They signed the lease right away and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also ended up demanding the queen-size bed, dresser and flat-screen TV for my guest room. I told them to just take the damn things because I no longer wanted them in the house. After they spent 5 months sleeping in that room, they looked at me like I was treating them as though they were diseased and demanded nothing more. The moment they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. When the move was finally over, they watched me start ripping the old lock off the front door as they were getting into the van. They said nothing. I said nothing. They just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a massive sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I figured karma had finally come for them and they could